On page 17, the workbook describes this concept of voltage versus time, which is the fundamental difference between cardiac rhythm interpretation and 12-lead ECG interpretation. So with cardiac rhythms, we're always looking at everything on the horizontal plane. We're looking at, let me just draw it out here. We're looking at PR intervals, we're looking at QRS durations, we're looking at QT intervals, we're looking at heart rates. All of those are time-related issues. And when we're looking at 12-lead ECGs, we're looking at everything in terms of voltage criteria and vector or axis. And what that means is that we're looking at ST segment elevation, ST segment depression. We're looking at the height of the QRS in situations where we suspect ventricular hypertrophy. We're looking at the P-wave morphology for evidence of atrial hypertrophy. So the voltage and the shape of the complexes becomes important here. And you might recall from my cardiac dysrhythmia interpretation workbook that QRS morphology and T-wave morphology, when it comes to rhythm interpretation, is completely and utterly irrelevant to our interpretation of the rhythm. But in a 12-lead, it becomes critically important because QRS morphology, for example, may help determine whether we're dealing with someone who has a right bundle branch block or a left bundle branch block. Atrial morphology might determine whether we're dealing with someone who has atrial hypertrophy, right or left atrial hypertrophy. And not that that's particularly critical information, but it's interesting to note. And so everything in a 12-lead is really voltage related or axis related or vector related. When I say vector axis, what I'm referring to is the deflection, for example, of the QRSs. So if the QRS is deflected negatively, that's a negative vector, if you will. And lastly, in one of the previous slides, I talked a little bit about this standard. And so every 12-lead ECG machine on the planet is calibrated to the same standard, which is quite remarkable compared to, say, other diagnostic tools. But and the standard is 1 millivolt. And 1 millivolt on the graph paper is 1 centimeter. So you should see a standard either at the beginning of each 12-lead ECG or at the end of the strip, somewhere around here. And it's worth taking a quick glance at it just to make sure that it's exactly 1 centimeter in height. You'll notice when you're monitoring ECG rhythms, especially in transport monitors, that oftentimes the default is set at 1.5, and that means 1.5 the standard. So that would be 1.5 centimeters in height. And this is important because sometimes on a monitoring lead, you'll see what you think is ST segment elevation, but then when you do a 12-lead ECG, you notice that it completely disappears. And that's because monitoring leads are not calibrated. So anything you suspect on a monitoring lead, you need to confirm on the 12-lead ECG.